everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk with Dr. Peter Mansoor, the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at Ohio State University. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and former senior military fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, and he authored 2 memoirs on his combat experience in Iraq. He'll be talking today with GNSI Research Fellow Dr. Guido Rossi, who just happened to be a protege of Dr. Mansoor while earning his PhD at Ohio State. With the U.S. strategic shift from counterinsurgency back to great power competition and large-scale combat operations, the two discuss whether the shift truly aligns with future conflict, if the counterinsurgency capabilities should still be retained, and what lessons from the years of practicing counterinsurgency can be applied to large-scale combat operations. While it's not exactly the same as the young Padawan confronting his former Jedi Master, it's still a great opportunity to listen in as the student reunites with his teacher.
Dr. Mansoor, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us today.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thanks for the invitation.
It's always good to see you. Ever since Ohio State University, you were my advisor then, and
the Ohio State
University. You're right. You're right. Today we're talking about how the U.S. military is now shifting away from counterinsurgency and counterinsurgency doctrine, and preparing itself instead for great power competition and large-scale combat operations, specifically against China or Russia or both. And but first, I'd like to begin by asking you, what is your personal involvement with COIN doctrine?
Yeah, so I was in the Army for 26 years. I was an armor officer. So the first part of my career, I was deeply involved in winning the Cold War. I commanded a tank company on the east-west German border. And then there was that interim period after the Cold War ended where the United States Army was trying to figure out what it was all about. And peacekeeping operations were in there in the Bosnia conflict. And eventually, after 9/11, the Army had to shift focus to counterinsurgency warfare, particularly the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I had 2 tours in Iraq. I was a brigade commander in Baghdad in 2003-04. And then after a stint at the Council on Foreign Relations, and then at Fort Leavenworth as the head of the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Center, General Petraeus selected me to be his executive officer to go to Baghdad with him in 2007, 2008, and help to execute the surge of U.S. forces under a new counterinsurgency doctrine, Field Manual 23-4, which I helped to edit a bit before heading over and implementing its concepts in combat.
Any specific aspects of 23-4 that you supervised exactly?
Yeah, so when the manual was nearly done, General Petraeus sent me the digits, and he said, make any changes that you want, and I'll take a look at them. And I was pretty adamant that we should put some sort of measure of how many troops were needed in counterinsurgency operations. And so there's a part in there that says successful counterinsurgency operations require somewhere between 20 and 50 counterinsurgents for every 1,000 people in the population. And I did that mainly because I didn't want political leaders in the future competing with each other as to how few troops they could send over to win these types of conflicts. Because counterinsurgency warfare is troop heavy. And I wanted there to be a measure in doctrine where we could say to political leaders, you're saying that 8 guys on horseback can win the war. And I'm telling you, doctrine says, you need 20 to 50 counterinsurgents for every 1,000 people. And 8 guys on horseback aren't going to cut it. So that was the part of the manual that I had the most impact on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Politicians are usually very good at selling war, promising that it will take just a few troops, just a few millions of dollars, not so much fuel. But,
and they can do it in 3 months.
Yeah. Both Afghanistan and Iraq proved otherwise. Do you feel like the concepts that you developed with General Petraeus were then validated?
For the kind of war we fought in Iraq, yes. So that's the conflict that we were all thinking about when we drafted 23-4. The base of FM 23-4 is that the population is the key. You have to control or protect the population in order to basically make it impossible for the insurgents to gain their support or coerce their support and thereby win. But that sort of assumes that the population, there's a small percentage that are pro-government and a small percentage that are pro-insurgent, and that there's this big gap in the middle where the population can be coerced or protected and moved one way or the other. Either towards the pro-government side or towards the pro-insurgent side. Where that sort of assumption is not operative, then the precepts of Field Manual 23-4 won't work. But they did work in Iraq, and that was the most important conflict we had to fight in the war on terror.
And what do you think then now about from a point of view then of conducting counterinsurgency, about the Russian occupation of Ukraine, considering that there is insurgency occurring in some of the areas that Russia has occupied, or for instance in the occupation of Gaza by the Israeli army. Do you think they are affecting effective counterinsurgency doctrine, or how do you evaluate their efforts?
Yeah, so I think this is a situation where FM 23-4 does not apply, neither of those situations, because the population can't be swayed in Ukraine to be pro-Russian. They're just not. They're going to be against Russia. Even if Russia wins the conflict, they're going to rule over a sullen and combative population, and there's likely to be a guerrilla conflict that Russia cannot win. I don't think it can win, period, but they certainly can't win it by trying to convince the people to side with whatever government they install in Kiev. I just don't think it's going to happen. Same way with Israel and Gaza. They're never going to convince the Palestinian people to support them. Maybe they can find a Palestinian government, perhaps the Palestinian Authority, that would be more attractive for support, and maybe then they could fashion their operations in order to support that government. And that might work. But if they were to go in and occupy Gaza, they will be met by resistance, regardless of whether it's Hamas or some other form of Palestinian resistance.
So basically, regardless of time commitment or troop commitment.
Correct. What Israel has sort of devolved to is a strategy of mowing the grass. It doesn't want to occupy Gaza, and so it will go in periodically and conduct military operations to kill Hamas fighters and destroy their weapons caches, and then they'll leave, and they'll do it again years or months later. And we'll see what happens after this conflict, because mowing the grass worked until it didn't. And on October 7th, 2023, we found out exactly how badly the Israelis miscalculated that their strategy would tamp down Hamas to an extent that was acceptable to Israelis.
So, but thinking again about the conflict in Gaza and the conflict in Ukraine presently, those are two types of insurgencies, right? And at the same time, though, the U.S. military has been saying, at least as far back as 2018, with the National Defense Strategy published then, and then restated again in 2022, that insurgencies is no more, and that we better shift off to preparing instead for large-scale combat operations in the context of great power competition, or also called peer-to-peer or near-peer adversaries. So the first question that I have, even before asking you if you think this is a wise move, do you think, again, like the first time that they stated that this was stated was in 2018, and it wasn't followed at the time because the efforts against ISIS were renewed then, and we're in 2025, almost 2026. Do you think it will start to be followed, or it will just still be, just words on paper?
So first, I have to take a small exception to what you said about Ukraine being an insurgency. There is an element of insurgency there, but it's a hybrid conflict, and there is a large element of large-scale combat operations ongoing in that conflict. Gaza is much more of an insurgency, but even there, that's also a hybrid conflict. So we see a lot of conventional operations that the U.S. military can look at and refashion their forces in order to conduct in the future, especially the integration of drones into combat forces, which you can see in Ukraine in a big way, that drones have refashioned the way forces can fight. I mean, basically, you need to have air superiority to conduct maneuver warfare, and neither side has it. Neither side is able to gain and maintain air superiority in Ukraine, and thus the front lines are frozen solid. But going back to whether the U.S. military should train for large-scale combat operations today, I'm reminded of people who asked me while we were fighting in Iraq, what should the U.S. Army train for? And my response was, as long as we're fighting here in Iraq and Afghanistan, we need to train for counterinsurgency warfare. But once those wars are over, I believe that the U.S. Army should once again train for large-scale combat operations. But educate broadly. If you educate the leaders on a broad range of military operations, including counterinsurgency warfare, the troops can be retrained relatively quickly. If you find yourself in a situation like Iraq or Afghanistan, it's only going to take a matter of months to retrain the troops, but it takes years to, rewire someone's brain. And if the officer corps is not educated in counterinsurgency operations, then they will simply revert to doing what they know how to do, and that is kill people and break things. That did not work in the first few years of the war in Iraq, and thus we had to redo the doctrine and conduct the surge. We should never be in that kind of situation again, where we throw out the lessons learned from Vietnam, because we'll never fight that kind of war again. We rejiggered the U.S. Army and the Air Force to fight the Red Army in Europe after we came out of Vietnam. And we did that very successfully. Air-land battle was an excellent concept and worked really well in the Gulf War. But it wasn't a concept for fighting the kind of war that we found ourselves in Iraq or Afghanistan after the initial large-scale combat operations were done. And we had not trained or educated the officer corps to understand those kinds of counterinsurgency conflicts. And so that it took a while to rewire their brains and basically have them understand that killing a lot of the enemy wasn't going to get the job done, that you had to get the protect or control the people in order to win this kind of war.
So at the very least, you think that perhaps with an emphasis maybe on preparing for large-scale combat operations, but the possibility for training also for counterinsurgency, at least from the leadership.
Education. So after Vietnam, all the courses at the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth on counterinsurgency were jettisoned. Over the course of 1970s, they first started out as the majority of courses, and then it was a minority, then it was just one, and then it was zero. And then in the 1980s, there was a group of instructors who tried to create just an elective course on counterinsurgency warfare. And they went to the JFK School of Special Warfare in Fort Bragg to ask them for their files on Vietnam, only to be told that they had been thrown away in the 1970s because the Army staff said that we'll never fight that kind of war again. We can't go down that road again. We need to at least have a course in the Command and General Staff College and the War College on counterinsurgency warfare or hybrid warfare, so that the officer corps is not caught flat-footed again.
A bit like, maybe I'm mistaken, a bit like jungle warfare that throughout the late 90s and then early 2000s was also abandoned. And then while the Marines instead, they continued training for it with I forget where the jungle warfare school for them was, but then the Army just a few years back reopened the jungle warfare training center in Hawaii. So kind of a similar concept. So the idea of maintaining the possibility, that capability, and then the possibility of expanding it in case then we get involved in that type of warfare again.
Yeah, similar but different. Jungle warfare is just a different environment. You can fight a conventional war in the jungle. You can fight counterinsurgency operations in the jungle. The jungle is the environment and not the type of war. And with counterinsurgency, it's a type of war. So I think the jungle warfare would require a training center, where counterinsurgency warfare doesn't require a training center, it requires courses.
Okay. Yes. Makes good. And it sounds like a very sensible recommendation to me. But in the larger scheme of things, do you think that I always think about predicting the future warfare as reading the tea leaves, right? It's not an exact science. Do you think that's where the world and history is headed right now? Are we heading more to, again, large-scale combat operations and the context of great power competition, or what do you think will be the role of insurgencies in the near future?
So the U.S. military has a pretty good track record of getting the next war wrong. In the 1990s, if someone had said, your next two wars are going to be in Iraq and Afghanistan, they would have been, told to go to an insane asylum. If in the 1980s, someone would have said, your next war is not going to be in Europe, it's going to be in Kuwait and Iraq, again, they would have been told they're nuts. We don't have a very good track record of getting the next war right. And so the military needs to train for a broad array of conflicts, focusing on those that are have the most significant risk and outcomes to the United States. Right now, I think most of the military would agree that China should be a pacing threat. The Trump administration might not agree with that. They seem to be focused on the Western Hemisphere and right now Venezuela. But I think if you look at what's the most dangerous conflict for the United States, it would be one with China over Taiwan, or if Russia decided to launch a hybrid war of the Baltic states, for instance, and got NATO involved. Those are the sorts of conflicts, I think, that we need to be training for.
And in your opinion, is it much more China than Russia, or much more Russia than China? Which one is more likely?
So it's both, but we have the advantage in Europe of having a lot of NATO allies that are ramping up their defensive capabilities and their armed forces. So I think that's a short-term problem. In the medium, longer term, I think we're going to see our European allies significantly augment their military capabilities, and that would allow the United States to focus more on China. Because in Asia, there is no groups of power absent the United States who can stave off a Chinese attack on, say, Taiwan. Japan can't do it alone. Vietnam is too small. Australia is too far away and too small. So it is the United States that's the key player there.
And South Korea as well.
Yeah, South Korea as well. They'll be focused on defending just their own homeland, much less defending Taiwan.
So this brings to the front of my mind the European allies. Do you think the contribution of the NATO allies in Europe will be an essential asset for preparing for great power competition, particularly if we will be facing not just one of the two enemies, but both?
Absolutely. So during the Cold War, or at least from the mid-'60s on, the United States could focus on Europe because China was not necessarily an ally, but they were not going to necessarily attack U.S. interests in Asia. They were focused on their northern border with the Soviet Union primarily, and on internal struggles, primarily economic. So the United States could focus on Europe and position several 100,000 troops there. It was not only the wolf closest to the sled, but it was the most dangerous wolf. Today, we don't have that luxury. We have a de facto alliance between China and Russia, and they're both out to combat the United States in whatever way they can. Right now, it's in gray zone conflict, but if that turns into a shooting war, then we're going to need our European allies to stave off any sort of Russian incursion in Europe while we focus on China and Asia, because we don't have the military forces to do both right now.
Some analysts and commentators, they're a bit pessimistic about not only about the abilities of the forces at hand that the United States have right now for confronting China, China more than Russia, but also about the mobilization capabilities. How do you evaluate those? First of all, do you think enough is being done presently to prepare for these fights? And do you think that the United States would be able, through a proper mobilization, to prepare enough forces and mobilize the industry enough to fight such wars?
I think right now we would be hard pressed to fight a world war. In the 1920s and 1930s, the United States put a lot of effort into figuring out industrial mobilization and troop mobilization. We had the luxury of time. In fact, we started mobilizing after the fall of France and weren't involved in the shooting war for 18 months, and that gave us a head start. I'm not sure we'll get a head start the next time. And I think it's going to take much longer to gin up our capabilities. The selective service system is moribund at best. It'll take a while. I'm not sure we have the number and size of training bases that we need. Industry is not in a position to ramp up its capabilities. And, it could get there if you just threw a lot of money at them. But then looking at our national debt, we're not in a position necessarily financially to fight a great power conflict, especially if it's a world war. So we've got a lot of work to do. I'm afraid that neither party in Washington is well equipped to handle it, and certainly they're not going to work together. So this is a real issue. I could envision a world war in which the United States loses, which is not a good prospect.
I will just ask you, so if you could establish some priorities, what do you think the most glaring gaps or shortcomings that should be addressed with priority right now? What would be the priorities that you think that should be addressed right now to prepare for these conflicts?
Yeah, I think at the moment, the military, all the services need to focus on unmanned systems and drone warfare and figure out how to operate in that kind of environment and win in that kind of environment. And that includes the use of AI to command drone swarms, the manufacturing capability to create drone swarms in the hundreds of thousands, and to have the capability to replenish those drones when they get destroyed. We need to figure out drone-to-drone air warfare so that we can gain and maintain air superiority over their future battlefields using drones. And this is going to take a mindset shift among the military. We're very good at creating very expensive, bespoke systems. The F-35 fighter, the B-21 Raider bomber, the Predator and Global Hawk drones, for instance. But we're not very good at what's happening in Ukraine right now, which is swarms of drones, some of them small, some of them large, all of them lethal, that are dominating the airspace. And we got to figure that out. And I think we can, but that's got to be the priority, at least tactically and operational. Strategically, it's a different story. We need to knit up our alliances and focus on integrating alliance partners into our operations, which I hope we're doing. But unfortunately, some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration is less than helpful in that regard.
The last question I will ask you is, what doctrines, what lessons learned specifically from the University of Counterinsurgency and from counterinsurgency doctrine could be applied also to large-scale combat operations?
Well, a lot of these wars that we can envision are going to be hybrid conflicts where there's going to be high-end combat for sure, but there's also going to be asymmetric conflict. You see that right now in Europe, where Russia's launching drones into Western Europe and inhibiting their use of their own airspace, even for peaceful purposes. We can see that with their assassination attempts and assassinations of key individuals, with their interjection into elections and their use of social media. So these are the same sorts of things that happen in counterinsurgency warfare. That you're in a fight for the people, and that fight is in all realms and not just the military realm. It's in the intelligence realm. It's in the information space. It's in the diplomatic realm. And you can take those lessons and apply them to the sorts of hybrid conflicts that are ongoing today, and not just in Europe, but in Asia as well. And I think those lessons will be quite useful going forward.
I can only thank you so much for talking to us today. And I'll just say that I was in Boston recently, and I saw on the bookshelf your latest book, Redemption, MacArthur and the Campaign for the Philippines. So I got a copy for myself, and it's on the bookshelf, and it'll be my next read.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the contribution. I hope you enjoy the book. As much as I did writing it, it was a labor of love.
I remember that you were conducting research, I think, when I was still to defend my own dissertation at the Ohio State. So
that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Guido.
Special thanks to Dr. Peter Mansoor, retired U.S. Army officer and the chair of military history at The Ohio State University, as well as Dr. Guido Rossi, GNSI Research Fellow. It was a great conversation, and we hope you enjoyed it. Before we end the podcast today, a couple things to tell you about. Congratulations to USF Associate Professor and GNSI Senior Faculty Fellow Dr. Stephen Neely, a previous At the Boundary guest, on the publication of his new book, The Anxious State: Stress, Polarization, and Elections in America. Dr. Neely explores the physiological toll of exposure to political conflict, the role of the media and social media in heightening anxiety, and the strain on personal relationships caused by polarization. At the risk of attempting sarcasm on an audio-only podcast, that's not at all a timely and relevant topic, right? His book is available for pre-order, and we'll drop a link in the show notes. We're also looking forward to the St. Petersburg Conference on World Affairs, coming up in early 2026. GNSI will partner with the St. Petersburg World Affairs Council to convene Outer Space, Collaboration and Competition on February 11th at the USF St. Pete campus. The conference will highlight national security issues in outer space, but also touch on law, diplomacy, space research, and the enormous aerospace industry in Florida. Astronaut Nicole Stott, a 27-year NASA veteran who lives right here in the Tampa Bay area, will be our keynote speaker. We'll have more information in the weeks ahead as we finalize the agenda. If you're new to the podcast, or to GNSI in general, I recommend you explore our library of GNSI decision briefs. As the name implies, they're short, easy-to-read explanations on today's national security issues, such as drones, critical minerals, Golden Dome, Israel and Iran, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We also cover underexplored but important topics, such as the U.S. military recruiting crisis, the use of hunger as a weapon of war, and how to best educate and prepare future national security leaders. You can find all of them on our website. Just click Publications. Thanks for spending some time with us today. Next week on the podcast, we're going to discuss the recently completed first ever Florida Security Forum. It featured an essential exploration about the physical and cybersecurity of Florida's ports and the national security implications. Even while we're working on the post-conference deliverables, it's never too early to explore important takeaways. We'll bring together key members of the conference team for a mini roundtable next week on At the Boundary. If you don't want to miss that episode or any other, be sure to rate, subscribe, and let your friends and colleagues know. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the alerts. You can also follow along with GNSI on our LinkedIn and X accounts at USF_GNSI. And check out our website as well at usf.edu/GNSI. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the boundary.